Hello everyone, today we talk about books that definitely for a history themed channel can be an interesting topic of discussion. Naturally, we will address mostly in fact historical contents, historical reads. I'm not going to list specifically books that meant something for me, but rather how to approach reading for some purpose that can be naturally very different from person to person, and that, however, is also contains some universality, if we can say like this. I think it's an important topic also because I get message sometimes, also privately. It happened a couple of times just the other day, asking, with questions what can I read about that specific topic? How can I be fundamental? And you understand, as I addressed also recently in other videos, that to me I sense quite clearly that questions like those are perfectly legitimate and positive, right? Aside from my advice, because I do advise people sometimes to read things I haven't read, right? That maybe I have. Because usually, and now I'll explain why, because my reads are pretty niche and somewhat, I functionalize to some purpose. It can be even Schwerpunkt, right? Let's say I open lots of books, but I don't finish lots of books. And especially when I work, because I have some tasks, something to write for, let's say, for the real world out there. Of course, I consult lots of articles and stuff, but honestly, I have lost the time ever since I started university proper to read as I used to do. I think reading, and this is a crucial part of somebody's personal growth. At the same time, I don't want to render the impression that a person that doesn't read books specifically doesn't has something less compared to those who do. Books, first of all, let's talk about the nasty stuff. They cost money, right? And simply people can't, it's not that they can't properly afford them, but let's say they say, why should I spend that amount of money for a book? Well, if you pose yourself that question, which is, again, perfectly legitimate, it simply means that likely in your life you do not need those books. That is to say, you need other things. Maybe you buy other books even, right? You make that kind of balance. But that is a very important indicator of how much you're in actual need of reading a book. The problem here is that naturally there is not a perfect homo economicus, rationalized, limpid understanding what we could need or not. And that's why I get those kind of questions. That is to say, what book do you advise to me? Presuming that I have read something, and therefore you can address me to the best there. And I sense that the point there is both that a person wants to acquire certain competence, certain wants to get a somewhat certified qualitative content. That is a bit I wouldn't say the trend of our times, but I mean the fact of customizing one's own experience with this ever more and tendentially cheaper, but potentially individually significant things in your life can build something more constructed. This is, I presume, in spite of the general criticism that I have towards the market of publishing, because even research is not devoid of certain issues. There are a lot of competition, which is fine, but at the same time, there are certain dynamics that do not really match with the qualitative process involved. Right? There is been a general fall in quality in publishing. I suspect I talk specifically about historical matters, but also this gradual customization, of course, can be useful if you have a plan, if you have a schedule, if you have a structure already by yourself, so that you know what you need, and therefore you can make profitable use of that. It's something different if you are just starting, like as a young person, right? On the other hand, in fact, there is the I come across ever more frequently with the understanding that people's understanding that books do lead to a path of self-improvement, right? As Annie reads, I was saying that you don't have to be, to feel disadvantaged or complex or whatever, if you haven't read properly many books, that you don't have the, your room full of volumes. I don't have either, right? I have actually lots of books that I have not read in the range of thousands, as I said, here and there. In my room specifically, I have just some hundreds, right? That were mostly either stuff I learned when I was at university. When as I was saying, I didn't have the time for reading much else, right? All the exam routine was pretty, demanding, mentally speaking, and therefore every time I stopped learning, I may have played, I don't know, a video game, or gone out, done something just to clear my mind, right? Because I felt committed to my duty, and kind of that absorbed my schedule in a sense in terms of mental resources. Of course, I actually read a lot of other stuff, mostly from the internet, but not only. And I even had the time between, I don't know, one year and another, between the degrees or something, to read actually a lot, right? With pretty good rhythms. Like, you could read in some months, good, I don't know, 100 of books. But also it depends what you read, actually, because there are, I've been reading sometimes 500, 600 pages a day, right? When I look at a book that I just wanted to finish, and I knew it wasn't that much, but just to know what it was written in it. So even there was a strategy, but as we will see today, reading actually requires a bit more of commitment if you are functionally hoping to use that information, especially for something serious, right? Because, as I always say, there is a great difference between reading, studying, but especially understanding a book or whatever's written. These are kind of self-explanatory processes. I mean, reading sometimes, when I read 500, 600 pages a day, or even more, I arrived, to 1,000. I think I even surpassed at some point, but it was crazy. You understand? What can you memorize from that? What can you get from that? It can be useful. You can actually taste the thing, the words, the broader work. You can appreciate certain things, but at a certain time, you know what kind of value you're going to attach to it. I must say that sometimes it was just about the satisfaction of saying, I've read that book, right? It had been in my living room since I was a kid. I was fascinated with it, never time to read it. Now I've done it. I have my, there's a shelf with all the Russian classics. It's my dream to finish them. I read a lot of them when I was a teenager. They were so formative. I would like to reread them sometimes. But because that does take time, and that's literature, and I don't have much time for literature anymore. Even though I like literature, and I think it was very fascinating. I think it's a necessary complement to a, in fact, complete. I don't even know how to define it. Education, cultivation. I don't know, some kind of like this. And as I understand, obviously my interests are primarily historical, and even in there, chiefly military in nature, right? And I'm not as you understand, even from the content I make here, that there is no specific, I'm not in that phase, as I was at some point, which I was obsessed about, just properly the military character, because it was military. Today, I know I have put myself on that track. I will be studying this thing for the rest of my life. I'm relatively satisfied about a point at which I've arrived, even though, I'm never satisfied about that. I can't, right? That's one of the first motivations for reading, learning more, actually. But, I mean, that can be for my own standards, for naturally what I have to do, even practically with that, my work and so on. That's another thing. I can't be more or less satisfied, and even though it's demanding, but you refine yourself over time. But there is always the ambition of expanding my knowledge, beyond at every time. My greatest dream, I must confess, possibly, like for eventually living life the way I want, is to stop time just to read all the books I have, which I know I won't leave long enough to finish, right? Because there are too many. I made the maths there, and I can't think realistically of finishing them. So basically, I leave next to books that I know I won't read. I will die before I will know what's written in them, and that's a powerful motivation as well. That is, yeah, there is a limit. You can't even measure that, and that humbles you, because it shows also, biologically what can a man do in its time. But the point still is there, the quality. I mean, the universe you can't find in a book, not much because of the information is contained in there. This is the theme of today's video. But how much you can connect what you learn from it to what you already know, right? And there, that brings us back to the question, what kind of book do you suggest? And I won't be saying, because there is not even a theme here, a main subject. Not even about warfare, right? If it was about warfare in general, yes, there are just the classics, they're mostly sources telling the truth. Maybe I will make a video about that and explaining individually why those books, the reds, are important. And honestly, I think I haven't made a big deal of them yet, right? For the simple reason that my approach with books is quite functional. That is, I normally read a book when I have a very specific interest, or I really want to learn that thing, understand it better, and before doing that, things always look more complicated than they seem, of course, when especially you have found the right book that more or less tells you what you already know you should know in order to phrase certain things, right? Even the simplest things. I mean, some of the most arcane things sometimes are the simplest, whereas we tend to oversimplify them broader dynamics. That's a mistake, because that's exactly the other way around. It's part of the reason why, for example, I make mostly ancient and medieval warfare videos, because let's be honest, okay, I'm a medievalist, okay, and I'm much into ancient warfare as well, in a sense, but it's easier than talking about modern, or even more, of course, of contemporary history. So much, in fact, that we expanded in the previous, in the former, and not much in the latter, right? And because simply there is much more to know, even just by degree of complexity of the system described, but let alone the quantity of information available. And naturally, the complication that brings from one side to the reconstruction, but at the same time, it's a more macroscopic evidence. It's just you can't be more spot on in that sense, but you are also more challenged when the more approximate you are, and the greater by scale the mistake, in fact the approximation itself is gonna be. So reading a book is something you can't do in the shade at the beach when you have nothing to do. That's okay, right? You can't. There are deep reds. You can. Some of the best memories I have reading books here and there between a swim and another. In those relaxed moments, you wait summer for relaxing and kind of taking your time to learn that information. So you can learn a lot, but at the same time, those tend also to be not extra. I mean, you're not studying. I mean, I would never bring the phone Krieg on the beach to read. I would always be very concentrated there. Why? Because I need to study that, which is a different thing, right? You have to arrive at a certain point, also to the realization that we're all exposed to the easiest books more easily than the most difficult ones, right? This would make interesting food for thought, a digression on the boundaries between, history, philosophy, political theory. The Von Kriege is a good example because it contains a bit of all this. So Obviously, there is somebody who can read that and say, "Oh, well, I got so much," without even knowing what he has read, right? And getting maybe some interesting insight, but not maybe even coming close to the point of that book. Um, but generally speaking, books that tend to be sold out there, that are more sponsorized, they're more out there, are the simplest ones. Are the ones that do not that are maybe even very informative, but do not show you the process that stands behind the information received. And usually, in fact, these are the cheaper books, right? So if you want to read something that you instead have to study in order to understand it, hopefully, it's likely you have to spend money. They're not even easy or handling books to to keep. They're just to be studied while sitting at a desk in silence, concentrated. And in there, naturally, it does make a difference between studying and understanding. That is something that also comes a bit through, like everything, to practice, in a sense, because of course, the more you read and the more skilled you become. But if you do not make an effort to really say, okay, now I have to begin this book to understand what it's written in a constructive sense, in a deeper sense, in a critical sense, well, chances are that you may skip, even if you read it, even more than once, what it actually contains. This is typical of young people. I remember I've read some of the greatest classics of literature at the time, and I realized today that in spite of I liked them, then I missed an enormity of a world, right? That, of course, literary criticism or other studies and so on can help you to expand. Because sometimes we don't realize the interesting fact of information is that there is always something more to it that you can't frame. That's why I was saying it's not much what you read, but whether you're able to connect it to other things right? That's the magic of learning. It's not about the algebraic sum, let's call it in this way, of the lines, words, quantities, whatever that you absorb, in a sense. But it's the number of connections you're able to draw between them and themselves, of course, but also all the rest that make really the perspective there, so they help you to dimension objectively reality as we can evidence it. So this I don't think I have to explain. I mean, it really requires commitment, like in everything. It doesn't. You need a reason. You need the motivation for that, because an average person doesn't really have that, right? Again, as I was saying, I'm playing with these books. I could theoretically do something about this. I could stop making Schwerpunkt and reading these books, but at the same time, even the fact I have to articulate a speech here, I have to prepare material, I have to check several books at a time, well, that also helps me to do something that naturally is functional to what I want to do here, but it's still different from extending my, it still shows me that I don't specifically need just that in life. And in fact, there is a bit, you'd think from a historian, from a person that stays in the so-called humanities, that there is kind of a classicistic, I don't even know how to say, intellectualistic taste to this. Absolutely not. I wouldn't say that a top priority in my life, for example, is reading like every single day that amount of pages, because otherwise I would feel wasted, right? Ideally, I would like to do it, but still, in practice, I know that there are more important things in my life. So reading should always come, and more profitably come, as a mean to an end, rather than just like I know people who have been reading all their lives, but objectively haven't accomplished much, even just intellectually speaking. Why? Because they didn't pressure themselves. They simply read a lot of stuff. They probably had interesting perspectives, but making an effort to really try to discern one thing from the other and to make an objective point to structure a method, a critical skill analysis. It's something that comes only when you have a difficult task. And a person that reads just books for killing time, or just because maybe they enjoy them, they love it, but still do not feel pressure in that sense, may become good readers, but not necessarily take an extra step toward a direction I eventually don't even care about. Right? I passed through some of these moments. Like just wanted to read a lot of books. I wanted to say, I've read all that amount of books in 1 month. Wow. Yeah, okay, and it was actually quite formative because I learned a lot of things. But were I to say that I understood what I wrote, what I read at the time, I was younger, yes, so obviously I wouldn't by a degree because of my age. But I must say that it's more that the quality and the structure I was given, for example, through university, that made me study, I don't know how many books. Not so many, so some tens of books, maybe in some year, right? I had to study them, I had to learn them to pass an exam. And that structured my critical skills, my analysis skills, in a way that if I simply hadn't gone through that, I wouldn't have developed quite the same way, right? I could have cultivated something else, but until you don't put yourself under that pressure, you can't know how far you can come in that regard. This is particularly important because, as you know, it's a bit like the philosophy around which Schwerpunkt revolves, just for most things here involved, war included. And it's really, yes, a struggle in that sense. It should be seen like that. Personally, I've never seen reading as an enjoyable activity, right? I enjoy the process of learning and the fact I could have that information for later, but the mechanics of reading, which is definitely present, it's even tiring physically, it's and mentally at some point. It's another thing. I dislike that. I found it boring. Right, my point was, reading, but let's hope this thing ends because I'm getting, it's taking away time from other stuff, and also it's kind of demanding for things that are, I'm not necessarily interested in. Because also, let's be frank about this, we may read a book and find it useless. I've rarely picked a book and said, okay, now I begin to read it and not finish it. I think it happened like once or twice because either they were garbage that I began, literally. I mean, you may say that some books contents are, right? I'm not for books destruction or whatever, aside from, some maybe extremistic idiocy that in that moment triggers me and makes me angry, but I'm not for, let's say, we should be able to read everything when we can, and even things that are fundamentally different from our perspective, our point of view, because variety helps. Variety helps you dimension the quality of a book. You may not know how useful a book is until you don't read others, right? And that's pretty evident, for example, with history. That definitely is the field that you test more books and you essentially search new information for, and sorting out the actual information you needed to answer a specific question. And there, that's where you also begin to realize, the deeper you go in information and in the processing capability, let's call it in this way, that books in general, right? When you're really, really interested in the topic, and you also are a bit, ahead in the same, are generally disappointing, right? Most books I read, I personally find them disappointing. Like, not because I say that they are bad books or they're badly written. On the contrary, I may get fascinated with them and also maybe reevaluate them over time, because at least I know you also have to know where to check. For example, I have so many books sometimes that I remember I have an information somewhere, but maybe it's just a part, maybe the rest of the book I don't care, but that information just by, it's crucial. But I don't know what it is. It becomes, the more you read in there, the more you the easier you're going to find information you're interested in. But generally speaking, like, I'm disappointed at authors specifically. I mean, the book can be great, but the point of the book, the aim of the book, the method, the information provided, and so on, may actually not be so satisfactory. And I speak chiefly referring to historiographical problems that today I wouldn't like to expand in, because if I were to make examples, probably it wouldn't render the problem effectively. But let's say, as I was saying, every mean to an end, right? Many people, for example, feel the need to find it, to read the great scholarly name, and to say, this is like, I found the Holy Grail, right? And everything is written in here. It's my Bible. I have to repeat it. I have to quote it, and I don't even need to know where this information comes from. It's just this guy's opinion, so it's fine. Now, reasoning by authority is fine when obviously you realize the quality of that authority. That authority is not undebatable in the first place. It just became so because it tends to be less debatable than others, but information is always debatable, and how you reach to certain conclusions, especially if you haven't provided, the mechanics of that demonstration, it can be profitably criticized. It's therefore, like, for a beginner, such books are important, but at the same time, I get the impression that analytical skills, or just the objective of recent historiography is not so devoid of unnecessary aspects, right? Just the other day I bought a book because I'm completing my PhD thesis now, and I found out the nightmare, that there was a guy that is my top scholar in the in the broader hierarchy of the studies I'm reading, that published a book just a few months ago now, exactly about, well, fortunately not, but broadly speaking, about the topic I'm writing. And therefore you freak out because he's first of all going to read your work, and secondly should obviously show that you have read up to the most updated, even the second before you sent the thesis to the correctors. If somebody has published something, you will be blamed for not having referenced your work adequately for that. And, well, for example, it's a beautiful book. The guy is really smart, really informed. Also because he's very old, he worked all his life through stuff, so it was fascinating. But it was a bit of a generalistic book, fortunately. And that showed that, reading lots of books also makes you understand what, maybe to a historian is banal, but let's say, what is a disclosure in book, what is an actual serious analysis, right? I've read, there are certain authors that write just for making money, and you read their books and you say, wow, this sucks, then eventually you read them when they have to write scientific work, and you say, wow, these guys are smart. You see there the difference between just, even there, to an aim, and a different context, and different measures of evaluation. So as a consequence, you understand that it's always better naturally to read scientific publishing, and but at the same time getting acquainted with the specific historiographical backgrounds, because certain countries, certain cultural areas, certain spheres are not always, there is not a kind of a standard way of writing, right? There are different philosophies, attitudes, more or less importance given to scholarship, for example, or to sources, right? I've always been, maybe I'm biased because for the Middle Ages it's obviously easier to go to sources at some level than and checking by yourself, right? So therefore I rather than by looking at the bibliography, maybe you have to read when you have a question about what you have read in sources and you want that answered, right? So it's obvious that the process goes in parallel, but there are significant cultural differences still in world's academies, that for however work that is in a literature and a publishing is getting ever more globalized properly, should be understood, right? And because that reveals to you also how and where some countries come up with that stuff. Like it gives you a perspective that you must be aware if you want to evaluate that information carefully, right? Always, sometimes I do find, and that book I bought, right? It's also from my own country, so I can criticize it freely. It was beautiful, extremely extremely informed. It was well conceived, structured, and so on. But it was still a general list, fundamentally, of events, and there was not much, for example, of a theoretical synthesis. That is to say, what was this book all for? It's all about, in my country, we do generally a lot of thematic stuff. That is to say, you write a monography, but it's not really such. It's just like different chapters that they talk all about a different thing that is not related with the others properly, right? I, for example, wrote a thesis now that is all related to, there are 7 chapters, and theoretically it's all one, right? Even if naturally there are different thematic sections, but they're meant to answer the whole thing. Especially when you look at disclosuring books, you see there, I don't know how to say disclosuring divulgative, because even in here there may be important semantic differences, but it's the idea of books that are, let's say, not commercial ones, like just for like magazines, stuff like that, but that are seriously, written by serious scholars, properly referenced, and so on. So that they are also for people who are a bit into those topics already at least university level, or a parallel one, let's say, even as amateurs, let's say. And that, however, doesn't get to a specific point, in my opinion. It's just showing, look, in the Middle Ages, it was in these battles, it was this, there, and that. Yeah, okay, but, have you explained, for example, how these battles worked, why they were fought? Is there even here, probably a scientific point to the story, right? Scientific here means a lot, because it's not just making a potpourri of, a melange, I don't even know to say that, of colorful information. It can be even, I wouldn't say folkloric, but, not strictly speaking looking at drawing a wall, but just small pictures. And what's the point of that? And also, the introduction of this book, frankly, would have quite altered von Clausewitz. There was a point where he said, we don't even know where a battle began or finished. What kind of statement is that? I mean, in a book dedicated to medieval battles, and that starts even, by the way, by saying, okay, we will talk about medieval battles, but we won't talk about their actual, the combat, how they work, how they unfolded. No, that is not important. Let's talk about, the surroundings of the battle. So the question is, okay, yeah, those can be really interesting, right? It's a beautiful book. I like it, but the question is, that field choice, was it justified? Like this, is that really what we need? Do we really need to make people kind of more entertained than mindful, than actually mentally challenged? Can't you make an extra effort, like at the end of your life, sadly enough, of a great scholarly life, to maybe say something more than the usual? That can be dictated by, I don't know, other motivations, as we were saying. Can be money, can be just helping objectively other people out there that, of course, may do not even know that these things exist, and it's a great deal in the first place for them to know, to have discovered them. So it's great. These books are not sold in enormous quantities either, so let me tell you, it's, sometimes, especially about certain topics like medieval warfare, etc., I wouldn't say it's a waste of printed paper, but the market is dramatically low, and fortunately, I'm actually happy to have paid money for this book, because that at least reinvigorates a bit the market, right? We should be happy to pay for books, because especially in those fields where we want to know more about, well, if you don't pay for it, there is no if there is no demand, people are not going to write about it, right? So there is definitely an economical dimension about also publishing and so on. You should be aware of. I don't know, frankly, what kind of books are sold out there. I'm completely, I mean, in general, aside from the subjects, I mean, what are the books that are mostly sold? I have no idea, frankly. I just know that quite likely they're not even the classics. I mean, they're not even. They're things that probably I would never read, even if I mean, if I could choose among all the rest, right? I remember there were some times I was even provided with books by external choice, and certain books were simply damn boring, and I didn't like them. They might have been thought-provoking. I was also younger. Maybe I didn't know exactly what was the word of them, but frankly, yes, I mean, it's fine to have your own tastes, but I also think that there are properly books in this regard, because I'm not a relativist, that are properly more or less useful than others. It's like for the topic choices that I make on Schwerpunkt. It's not about the randomness of military medieval stuff. It's about the fact that these topics, I believe, they are important, and I do recognize some are more or less important, and I try to point out. We also make these kind of videos like this one to give a bit of perspective relative to that topic. That is, what should I browse here? Like, what is that properly I need to learn? And this brings you back to the question, of course. So always be wary, naturally, of books that provide you with information but do not quite source what they're writing, right? That is usually the difference exactly between those books for a bit more pro people and those who are mostly sold out there to make a popular, to build a more consistent popular impression on that topic, and it's not a coincidence. So the issue here is realizing that you are, at the end of the day, the person who lets himself being fed or not by some author or another, right? You are properly the one who should be in charge in decision of what to read and what not to read. And as we've seen, that derives fundamentally from the the capacity of from more the quantity of books you have read and your own autonomous capacity of discerning the difference, right? But do not think, even if you're at the beginning, that there is a book that can solve the problem for you. Because as I was saying, it's like giving an historical information without context. Like if you want to begin learning about, I don't know, late Roman warfare, you should start from the sources in the first place. Then maybe you ask, where, is there a scholar here that topped, the others on this topic? I would like to dip in it. And then from the people do not like to read notes or read bibliography. I don't know how many do that, but when you really need an information, you start doing it by yourself. You start saying, what were the sources, the references here? You go searching for them and say, wow, he read from this book. So you go pick that book. You're gonna read it. You're gonna buy it. You're gonna go in a library to read it. I don't know how you do it, but that's how there is a motivation behind you doing that, and that's so banal, so simple, right? If you need basic information, I'm often heard, I'm often asked of, such basic information at the end of the day. Most of the questions I get about history and how it's manualistic information. That is to say, where do I know the basic chronological history of this people in a kind of a comprehensive fashion? Well, for that you can even check Wikipedia. I'm not kidding, right? First of all, because English Wikipedia is enough source to give you at least that bunch of fairly updated literature, especially for certain specific historical times and places. Yes, it's true. It's not complete. It's not a real. But literally, I mean, that's how flexible, how fluid knowledge is. I mean, Wikipedia is not a monster. It's not something you should spit on, right? It's like Osprey. Osprey Publishing, for example, the first one sucked badly. Now, today, they make good stuff. They don't fare very well, probably also because they have increased the quality in a sense. They've become more niche in a sense. I don't know. I don't know, honestly. I know just from a few years ago they weren't faring dramatically well, right? Also because of piracy, because there is a lot of that. But that provides you with an information that is usually well researched at this point, very well. It's a bright synthesis, like the degree of information concentrated, but also delivered with a certain linguistical effectiveness, also in terms of conciseness, but of actual information, it's very high, right? If you want to have a good insight of the standard topics, I don't use Osprey that much to make Schwerpunkt videos. It's fundamentally rare, but when we talk, for example, about types of soldiers, things like that, well, you open that, you surely find 3 or 4 things that are worth saying. That they give you the sources stated that it's how quick and easy and it's being conceived exactly like. That's why it's kind of nice publishing. Then you may find even certain experts that write maybe a book that I don't know what it was. I got the other day a beautiful book that the contents of which I didn't know because I had never actually read the series was drawn from. It was about the Bavarian army during the 30 Years' War, right? That's a fascinating topic. I missed that in my library. I was getting that, but it was like 120 pages, so it was almost Osprey style, but it was like outlined a bit more like in a bookish sense, in a bookish form, right? Also a lot of pictures and so on. So I wondered, is that all we know about the Bavarian army during the 30 Years' War? It's not that I want to know all the freaking sources. That's impossible. But is there somebody who spent time and energy to write something like that? Can write just 120 pages. That can be half of them circumstantial information, other charts and stuff. But that didn't seem. I haven't read it, but that's the impression I got immediately from just browsing it and looking at the information. Probably it's not going to satisfy me a big deal, right? I may find other interesting information. In fact, a more interesting book series that are very well researched, but at that point, for example, the information contained may be very, much more selective. That may not be a comprehensive, topic like the Bavarian army probably during the 30 Years' War, but it may have a more circumstantial historiographical cut. That is to say, I don't know, maybe the leaders, the politics, the process. Maybe it's not even a properly military history. So at the end of the day, and there are lots of topics like these that, believe me, have not been covered satisfactorily. There is also a lot of wargamistic stuff out there that aims at making this encyclopedical lists of all the regiments of the Swedish army of Charles XII. And you have there all the information. Then you read that, but maybe it's just a list of the various of a uniform where the battalion fought. It's very useful, right? But at the end of the day, is there a broader synthesis of how that army concretely operated? Maybe that guy hasn't studied that, right? You may know all the buttons of a uniform. I know people like that, but maybe you still may lack a broader tactical, strategical understanding of those times. And another very common thing is, in fact, as we're saying, hyper specialization on the grounds of not finding a proper cultural component to that. But having made all these videos now, last years, about that topic, about cavalry in general, history of Equestrian warfare, etc., I came to some conclusions that at the time I didn't know. Conclusions that I, of course, learned from others, from scholars, but based on evidence and understanding that there is a pattern that goes even beyond that, that is even sometimes more homogeneous than we think, right? We also should, when reading a book, we should be aware there is a sort of kind of unique, universal, human meaning to the fact that even a book is written, right? The fact that we can't, we're fundamentally all struggling towards the same direction, even when, because you see, what we read that doesn't quite define what we're gonna eventually think about. That is up to us. Even when we are in that phase where we read books for identitary reasons, right? That can even be positive ones. Like you read that book and say, I've read that book, it's changed my life, I'm all about that, it's so cool, others should read. Then you go a bit beyond and you realize that maybe even just spotting a favorite book doesn't actually make sense, right? So when history, in this sense, is a bit more pragmatic, is always a bit more functional, because it simply tells you, what the hell do you want to know? And you say, I want to know this. Okay, well, check that, right? It's more mechanic, it's more direct, and it helps, right? But at the same time, this information, as we have seen, is not immune from bias, in an unfair bias, would say, to be inaccurate at some levels, that you can train yourself to spot by simply reading. And at some point you will say, okay, you know what, I think there is something more that can be said, and then you'll start writing yourself. Writing and reading is possibly also the best integration, because also what you read may be your idea, but you still integrate it. And that's where historiography comes back, especially at this time, where in history, when it's been so much has been written that before you write something, you could even make another work based on, framing all the stuff that has been written on that topic, right? And that changes your mind enough to sometimes not even discourage yourself necessarily, but to at least maybe change a bit the aim of your question, of your research. Then every experience on this ground is different. For example, to me it happened that I had actually always, I must say, as you know, I don't think I'm a good historian. I mean, pretty mediocre, generally speaking. But if there's something I've had, I don't know whether by luck or something, is a good intuition. Like all the researches I had to do started from a question that, coming straight from my own curiosity, I found out to have been largely ignored by other people. All the theses, theses are written to be, are meant to be written exactly for generally, filling one gap in historiography, right? If somebody has already exhausted a topic, which may happen in practical terms, it's a bit difficult or useless, let's say better, to redraw a picture that that there are also people who are more expert and you have already adequately covered. But at the same time, I've always written about stuff that, I don't know, I could explain the single reasons, but that others hadn't cared so much about. And they weren't even, they weren't genial strikes. There were actually somewhat banal questions. That is, simply, why haven't we focused on, something that may have also possibly happened? Is there kind of a hint of that, right? And it turned out there was, right? Obviously, this wasn't about finding, Atlantis or something at all. I always like to be very concrete, even just about my criticism. And yet, I came to write objectively on topics that sometimes fascinated even the people that I had, my tutors at the time. that said, you know what, yeah, I mean, you're still learning, you're here to truly quit. But, I didn't know about that either, right? I have studied these things all my life, but I never thought of that. And it's maybe useful. And it happened to me to come back on historiography sometimes because I began to write this stuff, and I said, I just want to follow the intuition. Then you come back on historiography and you start saying, wait a second, but maybe somebody had addressed the issue, right? And maybe not so accurately, not so fully, maybe just en passant, right? But there was some idea here has not been developed. Sometimes even very old books are a gold mine of intuition, right? I was reconstructing a battle recently that basically is very famous, at least in my country, and for literary reasons. But historiography had fundamentally failed to, for example, just make a comprehensive reconstruction of the battle in a, aside from the myth that this literary reference had. I'm making it brutal here, but considering the scale of importance of the thing, there was relatively few written on it, and had especially ignored, for example, one source about the battle, a contemporary one, by the way, and it's not that there were many, there are few. It was a very meaningful one, and I randomly, without being an expert, right, I loved this battle since I was a kid, actually, but I had never studied the sources thoroughly up to then, nor had general backgrounds of the situation. I found the source, and I said, wait a second, but let me check all the studies that have been written in this battle. They didn't use the source. And then I grasped that somebody had, maybe because it changed significantly the tactical development of the battle. I rewrote this thing. Now, as you know, at the end of March I finished. We have been given extra months because of COVID now, but so I should have finished last year. It's finished now. It was very useful. I could expand a lot, even especially reading all these other books now that I had. And to this day, nobody had realized that thing. I rewrote that battle in a sense, and that kind of a big punch in the face to historiography is to say, what have you been doing? Right, and this is this part of broader problem. Nobody cares about military history in general. So the battles, like that book I bought the other day, that says it's a book about battles, but we'll not talk about their development. So what the hell? Who cares? I wrote everything exclusively about that, and I was very happy because I can't fill that gap, and it's quite silly, but to have left it open in the first place. So that's how. Literally, with a historiography that would, crush me because I'm just a parvenu, I could say. And these topics, it took me to just write something like that, and that's pretty embarrassing. And I don't know, the same author I wrote that book about, for example, wrote about another combat that I studied also with my tutor to check because it was a horrible pre-humanistic Latin that was written in a completely dysfunctional way, grammarly speaking, and we translated this thing. We realized that guy, this supposedly a military historical expert, had simply misunderstood the passage, or better, had not, had been lazy, had not tried to make sense of the whole thing, and had missed, actually, for that lack of context and, completion, a specific, very important aspect of that combat he was pointing out himself, but he had missed an important chunk of it, and it took me, I'm part of a big, my country's relatively large. I mean, in Europe it's one of the largest. It's we have a developed historiography. We're full Western kind of. There is a sound, but an astonishing amount of publishing and so on. Is it possible nobody ever come up with that? Okay, it's an obscure, maybe not the smaller fight here at the beginning of the 14th century was maybe people wouldn't care, but also more or less the literature about that those times warfare should include that combat is one of the most important, not the minor ones, right? But even the major battle before, is it possible nobody in hundreds of years came up with that thing but me, right? And I never thought I am better, because I told you how banal it was. But the fact that nobody had written, that's how easy historiography can be unreliable, right? And until you don't do it yourself, which, as I just showed you, was quite easy to do at the end of the day, until you make up your mind about the fact that you have to try to interpret a text, the sources, the question won't objectively come to your mind. So that's where reading can be tricky. Right? When reading can be really, more a complement to what you can develop by yourself. I like to say it like that. What you can write by yourself, and supporting what you write. Right? Another astonishingly empowering thing I learned during this path is that, even coming, as I told you, from a non-expert background about at least the era I was studying, because I've always specialized in military history, but so there is a universal language there that I profitably applicated also from the previous works. But it's the fact that I came up, even in there, for a 3 years project, by the way, with an intuition that was right. That is to say, I came to, and it was a mistake to do, methodologically speaking, to write basically what I was thinking before, straight, from obviously basing myself on the evidence I found, and then only eventually, looking, and this was a mistake we shouldn't do, because you should do the two things at the same time, but I ran that risk, and I was worried about that, I was aware of that, but here the magic happened. I checked the bibliography later, right? Like at least not the bibliography, I mean, I've read a lot of bibliography since the beginning, but the one that eventually would be specifically pertinent about stuff I found out, and maybe it's more normal and less risky than it sounds. That is to say, I found that there were things others had written around a certain topic that I needed to read, and that without that historiographical background, basing myself solely on the sources, I had come to the very same conclusions. And those people studied the thing for a long time. I had never studied that, but I based myself exclusively on the sources, and it turned out I actually wrote something that was even more spot on than what those guys had written, and that, however, they helped me by things I had written, because I integrated here and there to back the evidence, how I had found it, and the dynamics that I found it were in fact being spotted vaguely, but substantially collecting the information all together, scattered from here and there. That's what the historiography is interesting about, to make a complete picture that, lots of scholars contributed, sometimes even without a specific aim towards what I was writing, but randomly en passant. That's the magic of what you can write, and that how eventually I hope this thing will be read at some point. Maybe will be translated in English. I don't know. I would like that, honestly, because it has a European scale of relevance. You can see it talks specifically about European warfare at that time altogether, even if it focuses on one region and there is a bit of comparison with with other countries, but it fundamentally poses a big question that has not been developed profitably, and somebody will read that, and I don't know, for example, that is not a text that is just to be read. It's rather long, right? Very long, actually, but it is meant to be just read. I kept it simple, right? The structure is somewhat elementary, considering the broader logic of the question, that is, let's simply check how certain armies worked out there in the field, and let's compare tactics that were used in that region at that time with an astonishing amount of evidence, by the way, because we're very well documented, but nobody looked much into that before. And let's confront it with other things that were happening in Europe about which historiography said it was such a big deal, and let's confront it with that area nobody wrote about. And the question there is that we found a huge hole left, uncovered, that may give not a completely, but substantially different perspective about things we thought like before. For some would sound subtleties, because of course we know more or less what medieval warfare was, but don't think that the ways this is written or explained are always clear or objective. For example, sometimes, like once a month, I use Philippe Contamin's La guerre au Moyen Âge, that is, a big type. It's from the 80s. I mean, it's a very famous book for, like, it's a bit like the ABC for an introduction to medieval warfare, right? The guy has a hell of an education. He's dramatically informed, but that book, for example, since the first time I read it, it was interesting, but even in there was kind of disappointing. That is to say, you want to, I don't know, you can find a lot of information there, but is it framed in a comprehensive way? It's somewhat thematic, somewhat, it doesn't talk for very much in terms of actual tactics. For example, that on a book on medieval warfare and battles, there was just a bunch of examples of some standard stuff about, the Burgundian plans of during the time of Charles the Bold, but not much of a deepening. It's a general introduction, very well informed, but it can't serve to a huge purpose. But at the same time, does it have a leitmotif there? Doesn't seem to me, right? Because it's just, let's pour out information, then let's let it framed by someone else. Here, just let's use big containers to frame the fact. Yeah, I'll say let's talk about morals of warfare, sieges, stuff. Yeah, but how the mechanics of this stuff, like in a broader structural sense, there is interesting information there about that too. I don't want to say it's a bad book at all, but at the same time, it's it misses information. For example, the I can't say it's Western centric, but there's a few about Eastern warfare, Eastern European warfare, right? It's mostly about France, Italy, and England, right? Something about crusades, yes, but just because they're the biggest, more punching things. But what about the rest? Objectively, the rest may have been, aside from the Reconquista, might have been less relevant, just by sheer amount of, number of people, number of well managed, number of sources produced. Yes, of course, those are the parts you have to concentrate on, which is also that book renders justice to a European view of the Middle Ages proper. That is not just a specifically Western-centric perspective, because it does provide the eminence for the most of what we know, right? But yes, there is a bit of Western centrism there, but just reading, for example, a French author, it's very different from reading, I don't know, an English author. There is a different historiography, a different academy. It's a very different mindset, and it produces, obviously, it gives attention to things that others may not really care so much about in other areas of the world, because they maybe have never heard of a thing rather than another, and vice versa, by the way. There could be lots of things to be pointed out here, because that's another big issue that I try to deliberately avoid, but it's obvious, I don't know, that the French perspective insists a bit more on for example, the importance of the Carolingian Empire, post-Carolingian times, rather than, an Anglo-Saxon perspective is about more the British Isles, even the Celtic fringe, the Viking Age, right? It's you understand they both recognize both at these times in historiographical development, but also that sometimes historiographies have expanded towards certain directions because of logics that are not driven by pure curiosity, and not even by just simple bias, but specific dynamic that can be also interested. I wouldn't say just economically, but or academically, but that tend to lean towards a certain side or another. Reading lots of books helps you to evidence that, and knowing where to kind of how to be aware about that, to handle that. And you may be you may not actually be surprised to know that in fact some of the largest gaps still present, I mean the unexplored parts of medieval warfare, actually derive exactly from this. That is, and that's what reading about history teaches you, that it's not about the single information you can find in an archive, or about a local history or whatever, but it's how you frame this stuff. That is to say, there are important chunks of Europe, of the world, that have been left out from a certain interest, from a certain understanding. Local historiographers may have done well about it, but still being, for example, concentrated a bit too much on themselves, or simply not being considered by others either. And this produces literally some emptiness here and there between major historiographical topics, let's say, leaving others lots of space in between that is not being covered. And that is the challenge, I would say, for the future, because reasoning through those, acknowledging at least and properly getting acquainted about the problems directly means to have chosen a path that is very different from the most common one today, that wants you to transform you in a little mechanized specialist that fundamentally doesn't look at 10 centimeters from his nose, right? And that studies medieval history condensated in a manualistic exam the first year, then eventually doesn't touch certain topics medieval history for all his life, and will just focus on the PhD and nothing else, right? That is not a healthy way of boosting civilization. Civilization has to do with you being able to frame even, of course, the most specialistic information in a comprehensive way. That how education works today, secondary education works today, it doesn't function, right? We fail to do. I mean, I'm not here to present alternatives or better. There would be alternatives, but they have to do both with collective and individual responsibility. So you may even wonder what's the most important. Well, probably there just should be a bit more of bit more serious and severe selection process. I don't want to even say how discriminatory it can get. Like, would you want to make pass the guy who just has a quick kind of IQ high thing, or the guy who knows, for example, a lot of stuff at once, eventually will able to work on that, because there are different results at the same time. But if it was just about the seriousness of, say, you don't know the dates of the Crusades, basic manualistic exam, medieval history, you don't pass. You come back, and you know that, even if it's the least thing that you have to know about the Crusades, because chances are that if you don't know that, you don't even know what happened in the single Crusades. So, in fact, there is a lot of misunderstanding, even if just we teach history at this point, that has become like a bit the idea of it. No, it's not the idea of it. You have to study the major themes, the major perspectives, problems, etc. Yes, no problem. But you have to know also by heart a ton of stuff, because otherwise you won't have any solid point of reference. You will just, vague get lost in the clouds with no standpoint. That's another thing, of course, in responsible terms, is not to think that you are a competent person just because you passed, a history exam or took a degree, but because you decided to spend your entire lifetime learning, that is studying seriously and understanding seriously a lot of stuff. That is also something we don't have the coercive means to impose, but we can definitely have the motivation to impose, I presume, to make the world better, right? It takes a lot of moral resources, but that's what should make the difference between competent people and competent people, that is, those who have to rule and those who don't, right? I know it sounds harsh, but that's the truth. We work like that, and it wouldn't be fair to others either to make them believe, okay, it's just it's normal that everybody now takes a degree and pretends that has to find a job, or that degree is going to be worth something, because chances are it's not going to work like that in the real market. And this has nothing to do with humanistic or scientific education. This is to do with actual quality of information, of knowledge, of criticism. It's crucial. But we don't have a serious talk about this. The only talks now are about, making everybody feeling all right about the fact that they can't make it. From some decade now, and that's silly. Like, it can't be useful maybe as a socializing process. Like, you don't have to be blamed if you fail. Yeah, that's true in part, but at the same time, you should learn the harsh lesson. If you don't do anything in your life, you may either you have some serious problem, or if you look at a high school program, I mean, a person at 18, 19 years old should know the stuff like an adult. And the rest, you had a traumatized childhood, whatever. That is a serious problem. Nobody helps you. That's a big deal. But if you're just a lazy, spoiled ass that doesn't do anything all the day long, you should be deprived in part of the possibility of going ahead. It already happens like that, right? You come short of expectation, but I'm sorry for you. It could work like it, because the fact that you're a minor, it doesn't mean that you're an idiot, right? And people can work differently, but there are still certain human standards that are universal. So it's not. Also the idea of that there is no coercion in education is silly, because who does bring the children to stay seated there and listen? If parents do not take them there, that they get arrested, or I mean maybe not, but I mean they go against serious problems, legally speaking. So we can't be hypocritical about it. We have to enforce something, but we have to do it by ensuring that this enforcement produces, of course, that original synthesis, that creativity, that autonomy, that independence, right? These are not two opposite models. They're just one the consequence of another, and that's the big lie we've been told that is not true. That discipline it's against results. So it's silly, right? There are certain countries that are stressing this fact. Homework is useless and all this thing. It's completely false. That is measured just on the base of certain markets that just want to use to select since an early age those who are not going to, just going to make cheap labor, and those who are going to be, more advanced. Yeah, maybe even more functionally, economically speaking. That has nothing to do with developing intelligent human beings. That has just to do with you having just a florid situation in the moment, can't afford people to remain, the majority of people being dumped, where the elite more or less makes things work. But that dumbness is gonna be a burden socially. That it is what you didn't invest in those people, and young minds are the best investment ever in all history of mankind, right? The fact that you haven't invested in them is just stupid from your side, because also elites are stupid. They are of course more intelligent than the rest of the people, but they can be stupid as well, and that is going to be a social burden. In 2-3 generations, we'll have a bunch of, the majority of people being just too dumb to even understand what the hell is happening in the world, and the consequence is quite evident in there, right? Somebody else will take over their place. There will be other issues, right? We don't know how it will go. We can't really make spot-on predictions such a long-term range, too many factors intervening from the rest of society. But education-wise, if you don't teach a person the value of learning, whether it's a book or whatever, right? Again, I said it doesn't have to be a book necessarily. You're not an outcast because you haven't read books. But still having taught this person how to be curious about life and to know the value of hard work and look through measuring it on the base of results, right? And giving them a resolve and sense of empowerment, of autonomy, independence. That is what human beings are supposed to be. The rest, we don't need them. And unfortunately, in the sense, we don't need a lot of people for a lot of stuff. And that is going to be a problem. That is already a problem. We are suffering dramatically from it because we are in the eye of the storm of this process right now. Because it's been on since two generations now, almost three. It's kind of a very serious problem. And all these people now are done for. You can't re-educate them. So for a consistent amount of time, you'll have to pay for them in a sense. But it's a bit depressing as a term. But it's obviously always about the fact that you can't expect things to go well by themselves. You have to be able to consider, and the more you specialize, and what happens, the least people are going to make long-term projections and plans, and will have the least intelligent proper they will be, right? I'm deeply convinced of this. So it has to be general and special at the same time, right? Generalistic, specialistic at the same time. You can't be either one or the other. Even when, because it doesn't matter what we're talking about. This should what is the school should give, right? School today, if you look at programs, they're not bad, right? We arrive to a point if children actually, kids in general, learn like all what they're supposed to learn in school, they would be hella very developed people for their age. The problem is they don't do that, right? So even in there, it's useless it's even in there a matter of motivation. If this happens, it's because something lets it happen. It's a broader social problem, but it does stem in part also from educational problems that have not been resolved, progressed ones. Reading is a cure. Reading is a medicine. Let alone pretending that this excessive freedom in customizing your own life can really bring people to pretend that they're not meant to make an effort for society as well, that they don't have a responsibility, that it's all about your freedom. It doesn't work like that, right? Libertarian positions, I've been largely sympathetic towards them, but it turns out the more you study history, the more you realize they don't work that much, right? At least there is a balance that's not ever from one side or the other, and that balance comes only through you getting out of your shell and realizing that it doesn't matter what political opinion you have. Reality doesn't give a damn about you, because objectively you in front of reality is hardly something relevant, right? And let alone those who can make a difference in the world. And it turns out that it's exactly those people that are more, they are beyond such things. Well, so we actually digress towards the end, but I guess it's, it's always important, I think, to address these educational problems, because reading is to be functional to something. Right? It can't be just like drinking something, playing video game. I have a great respect just even for video games, telling the truth. Not an excessive fanatic one, but let's say those can help too, right? It can't be, education has to be structured, varied as well, customized as well, yes, but it does require, first of all, motivation, a force, something that makes people accomplishing scattered results, not just the ones they think they can't reach, because until they reach them, they don't know that they can, right? And what they're about. And that's why we have mandatory education. and it has to be an imposition because there wouldn't be anything else possible. There wouldn't be an education otherwise, or it would be, but it would be much less functional and actually, well, alright, for now, however, stop it here. We'll surely discuss these issues, especially educational ones, some other time. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.